Good afternoon, folks. This is the beginning of the course entitled Introduction to Western Philosophy. In fact, this first presentation is an introduction to that introduction. What I want to do in the course of the next hour or 3/4 of an hour is to give you an idea as to precisely what you're getting into. What is the nature of philosophy? Perhaps answer the question of the whys. Why are you doing philosophy? What relevance does it have to your main course of study and your career goals and objectives? Is it of any relevance? It is just a waste of time. These are important questions that need to be answered. And I hope that by the end of the discussion this evening, I will have convinced everyone who need convincing that you are doing an important subject, a subject that certainly will contribute significantly to your more effective discharge of your responsibilities as pastors, as theologians, as apologists for the Christian faith. Philosophy is a very ancient subject and a very important subject. The word itself signifies what it means. Philosophy is really the love of wisdom. Again, most of these terms that we're going to be looking at this evening have Greek derivations, and I know that you all are excellent Greek students. So the phil means love, and the ology refers to the logos, body of knowledge, ideas, reason, rationality, the love of reason, the love of wisdom. And wisdom, in a sense, especially as used in former times, in ancient times, did have not only a knowledge focus, but also a focus on character development and on moral duty. Right? There's an extent to which one expected that with the increase in the knowledge that one acquired, one would become a more excellent person. One would be able to make a greater practical and moral contribution to one's society. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, and therefore it has, in a way, a dual concern. It, on the one hand, seeks to acquire knowledge and understand and know everything, and on the other hand, to make us better persons in the end. Now, a number of people are not too sure whether you can categorize philosophy as an art or a science. In a sense, it's both, because philosophy is really a foundational subject. It really stands at the root of all the various sciences or bodies of knowledge, at the root of the arts and the humanities, as well as of the physical sciences, chemistry, biology, physics. Underlying all of these are significant philosophical issues. And when we get deeper into the discussion this evening, you're going to recognize why philosophy is so important and why it's so relevant to all branches of knowledge. Very often people make the interesting distinction between these two varieties of knowledge. C.P. Snow calls it the two cultures. On the one hand, they are the sciences, and on the other hand, they are the arts and humanities. All of these constitute knowledge. All of these make claims to communicating truth, to developing understanding, to giving people an insight into what is. But they're really very different approaches to an understanding of what is truth. There are different approaches to the communication of truths, of information to the mind. The sciences very often use very rigorous methods of empirical evidence and logic and so on, and mathematical accuracy in order to establish the authenticity and the reliability and the truth of what they signify. The arts claim to do it also, but in a radically different way, because the arts are not dealing so much with the physical truths of an external world, which could be examined, which could be experimented on, and so on. The arts are dealing much more with another realm of knowledge, right? And the arts are concerned with values, they're concerned with concepts, they're concerned with ideas, they're concerned with movements and institutions, things created within human society, not things that have the tangibility and hardness of rocks and stones and trees and other people and buildings. So there are really two areas of knowledge, and they have different criteria for validation. And so the question as to whether something is an art or a science is determined by its approach to the acquisition of knowledge and its claims, right, to the manifestation or the ascertaining of truth. Philosophy really spans both of them. And if when you read the philosophers, you'd realize that some philosophers are oriented much more to the sciences. And that is very characteristic of late 19th, 20th century philosophy, right? The dominance of the sciences, the tremendous success of the sciences compelled the philosophical minds, right, to try to understand the very foundations of scientific thought, of scientific discovery. And as a result, you have a number of contemporary philosophies, such as analytical philosophy or positivist philosophy or linguistic philosophy, which are really oriented to the sciences. But a number of philosophers, and traditionally, perhaps even most philosophers, have much more been men of the humanities. They like to discuss ideas. They do not get into the laboratory to experiment. They prefer to analyze something from an essentially and definitively logical or rational standpoint, to investigate things and to use criteria that are derived from rational discourse, the demands of rational discourse, much more than the demands of the laboratory. So there are a number of philosophers who are oriented much more to the arts and some to the sciences. Philosophy, therefore, is foundational and it embraces both arts and sciences. Philosophy, as I think I mentioned when we had our first chat, is really a very relevant subject for theology because it's very similar to theology. In the Middle Ages, these two courses, these two disciplines, these two liberal arts, as they were called in the Middle Ages, these two liberal arts dominated the medieval curriculum. Philosophy and theology, in a way, competed with each other, and in a way, they worked together to provide a foundation for the other liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, as they were called in the Middle Ages. And there's a sense in which they continue to do that. But very often, philosophy and theology can be in competition because theology goes beyond where philosophy can reach. Philosophy depends on the use of reason. It depends on the logical consistency with which ideas are put together. It depends on principles such as the relationship between cause and effect and so on. It depends on evidence of the senses, and it depends on, to a large extent, the rigor of logical argument and discourse. Theology goes beyond that. Theology also depends on these things, but goes beyond that because it claims that there are fundamental limitations to human rationality, to human knowledge. And as we discuss later, even this evening, we recognize that that is very much so. Even the philosophers recognize their own limitations. So theology goes into the realm of the transcendent. Philosophers do not dare enter that realm because they do not have the intellectual equipment that prepares them to examine anything in that realm. The realm of the transcendent, the realm of God and of heavenly beings and of angels and of spirit and so on, is a realm inaccessible to philosophical investigation. Theologians deal with that. And those are some of the areas where you may find that they would conflict. But theologians generally appreciate the contributions of philosophers, and very often the arguments that they advance in their apologetic and the hermeneutical discussions and so on is very often depends on the same kinds of intellectual resources and linguistic resources that philosophers need. There are three main areas of philosophy, and I would like to mention those three main areas and investigate them next. The primary area, I would say, most fundamental area of philosophical investigation and inquiry is the area of what is called ontology. Ontology, again, from Greek derivation, having to do with the nature of ontos, the nature of being, the nature of existence, reality, nature itself. But that's what ontology is all about. It seeks to determine exactly what is the essence of the natural world. What does it consist of? What are its foundational qualities and principles? Right, that area of ontology is an area that philosophy is very, very much concerned with. We see when we get to the earliest philosophers, they were primarily ontologists. In fact, philosophy began with ontology in the early Greek period. And the Greek ontologists, the Greek philosophers, were indistinguishable from what we now refer to as physicists. Right? They were trying to understand the nature of reality, the physical reality that was around them. And they asked the question, why is there something about it or nothing? That famous question that was asked by Leibniz in the 17th century. Why is there something about it and nothing? So that philosophers seek to go beyond the what of things. What essentially do things consist of? To why do things seem to be as they are? Why do they behave as they seem to behave? So philosophy, ontology is an extremely important area of philosophy. It's a fundamental questions and issues that philosophers are prepared to deal with. And philosophers talk not only about being, but they talk about non-being. They talk about, very often for many philosophers, non-being is as much a reality as being is, because being has its limitations, and outside of the limitations of being is non-being. And when you look at a world that is essentially a world of diversity and a world of change, there seems to be a moment between being and non-being that is also of concern to them, and that is the moment of becoming. So ontologists are concerned with being, the state of things as they are, becoming, the fundamental transition that is evident in the nature of things, and non-being, which signifies all that seems to lie beyond the limitations of being and becoming. Well, that is fundamental. Very often the word metaphysics is used interchangeably with the word ontology, metaphysics. And the metaphysical is that which really is beyond the physical. Given the concerns and interests of philosophers or ontologists that I just referred to, you can well understand why metaphysics seems to be so very relevant. Meta means beyond in Greek. Physics has to do with the physical world, the world of nature. So metaphysics deals with that which is beyond nature, beyond being. And clearly, if the concern is going to be a concern about being, becoming, and non-being, then it goes beyond being. It goes beyond physics. Metaphysics does not mean the same thing as ontology, but very often is used interchangeably with the word ontology, so that you find that we're going to be talking about metaphysical concerns and ideas. Some philosophers would say that religion is essentially foundationally metaphysical because it goes into the realm of the transcendent. And that is beyond physics. The realm of the transcendent cannot be examined with the intellectual tools and instruments of the critical instruments that you use in the physical material world. So metaphysics and ontology is foundational to the whole question of um, philosophy. And then there's the question of epistemology. That's the second big question. In fact, since I would say since the Renaissance, it seems as if philosophers are far more concerned with epistemology than they are with ontology. In fact, increasingly with the rise of science, philosophers left the issue of ontology to scientists. And they concern themselves with epistemology. And epistemology has to do with theories of knowledge. Philosophers want to know, how do I know? What do I know? When I say that I speak the truth, what do I mean by saying that I speak the truth? Do I speak the truth in an absolute sense? Do I speak the truth in a limited partial sense? Do I speak the truth in a relative sense? Am I speaking an objective truth, right, that has a correspondence in the state of things, state of affairs in the real world? Or am I speaking a subjective truth which reflect the own conditions of my internal mind? The notion of truth is not an easy notion, and philosophers are very much concerned with it. How do I know? How can I be certain that this limited biological organism, this speaking mammal that we call man, how do I know that my mind is equipped to understand and to penetrate the nature of the universe? I have no guarantees about that. I am equipped with 5 senses and I'm equipped with a large forebrain. Right? That large forebrain gives me the power to speak and the power to reason. And I'm not sure that that suffices to understand and to investigate the realities that are around me. So mysterious, so complex, so diverse they are. Can I be certain, for example, that everything I see, right, is what it is? Do I see things as they are? Or does my sight, the powers of my sight, right, the light rays that strike the retina and so on and go down to the occipital lobe for processing, when all of that happens and I claim to see something and I describe that sight, does that sight represent or correspond to the object that I'm pointing to, that I claim to define? Philosophers are not sure about that. And very often, a lot of philosophical discourse seeks to examine that and discuss the nature of knowledge and with the recognition of the limitations of the human mind. So epistemology has become a very significant area of philosophical discussion and investigation. And more, you would find that contemporary philosophers concentrate on the area of epistemology. Now, there's one thing that makes us, very, very dubious, makes very dubious the truths that we claim to have, the truths that we claim to hold in our minds. Some of them we claim are self-evident truths. And that has to do with the very simple experience of sleeping and dreaming and falling into the dream consciousness. Everybody has that experience. You dream, you go to sleep at night, you dream. And in that dream world, you see objects just as you see them in the real world. Maybe a little more fantastic, but you see friends, you see you see familiar sights around. Sometimes you even have sensory experience of touching and feeling and holding and handling and managing objects in the external world. The experience of dream is a very interesting experience. Everybody knows that you're going nowhere. Your body lies motionless in a bed, but at the same time, you seem to be able to travel outside of the body. That's a very significant experience, because that experience formed the basis for the notion of this separation between body and soul, or body and spirit. But it also problematizes the whole question of knowledge, because when I awake and I enter the world of the waking consciousness, the real world that is around me, I have a similar experience. I see objects in that world. I touch them, I feel them, I manipulate them, I work with them. In all people's experiences, unless you have certain fundamental psychopathological problems, you can distinguish between waking consciousness and the dream consciousness. But the dream consciousness, that experience that you have, forces you to question, to interrogate the validity and the authenticity of what you are actually perceiving when you are awake. Can I not be in another dream, a dream at a different level? Perhaps I'm in two different states of dreaming. And it may well be that just as my mind is concocting and creating and generating all of those images in the dream world, my mind may also be doing something very similar in the real world. I may be generating images perhaps in a far more tangible and meaningful way. And my concern, the whole orientation and focus and project of my organism may be not to get knowledge of the external world, but merely to survive in the external world, to find food and find a mate. Some people reduce all of biological life, not just human life, but all of biological life to those two functions: finding food for the survival of the individual organism and finding a mate for the survival of the species to which one belongs. So the problem of dreaming, and in fact, modern philosophy begins, when we come to the area of modern philosophy, we see that that was one of the major speculations of the famous René Descartes, who is considered to be the father of modern philosophy, a Renaissance philosopher, who began now to re-examine everything at a very foundational level, and who introduced that argument as he problematized the whole question of knowledge. He's the man who came up with the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." And in a sense, all I have, or the only certainty I have, is the certainty about my existence. So epistemology is a very, very important area of philosophy. And as I said, a number of contemporary philosophers are primarily epistemologists, and many of them have abandoned the project of trying to understand the nature of reality, which most people, not just philosophers, but most people believe can best be provided by our fundamental scientists, right? The people in the hard sciences, the chemists and the biologists, and the physicists more especially. Now there's a third area that is also very important, a third area of philosophical discussion, and that third area is the area of axiology. What is axiology? Axiology, again, it has a Greek derivation, refers to the realm of values. Philosophers are concerned with the real world. They're concerned with the world of objects, the world of tangible, material, physical objects that we can experience through our senses. I can see trees, I can see rocks, I can see the sea, the beautiful sights around, and I can see other people operating in my own world, operating around me and forming relationships with me. I can see and experience those things through the senses. I can understand them through the intellect. But the realm of values seems to be a very rare realm, but cannot be located anywhere in the physical material world. When I talk about values, and we talk about things like beauty or righteousness or justice, right, or peace or humility, all of these are values, and many of these values would be familiar to Christian practitioners. Right? When I look at the realm of values, I can't locate values in the world of trees and plants and rocks and animals. It's not there, but it's very real. Whenever the individual experiences injustice, he responds negatively to that experience. And one of the things about values we have discovered now, at one time we thought that values was a very human thing, that it belonged to the human world, the world of God and human beings. We have now discovered that the world of values is a world that extends throughout the mammalian species. Almost all mammals, from mice to bats to lions and tigers, elephants, they also operate in accordance with a sense of values. They also have a sense of justice. They also know what it is to love tenderly, what it is to give one's life for the tribe, for the group. They know what it is to feel tenderness and affection and intimacy. They know what it is to feel anger too, and to distaste and dissatisfaction with the state of things, right? So values we can detect, sociobiologists have been able to detect the purveyance of values, right, throughout the living world, the living, sensitive, intelligent world. And intelligence is not just a human species, a human quality. In fact, people are now talking about plant intelligence, right? Because there's some behaviors that we see even in the vegetative world, the plant world, a world that seems to be so very far away from the world of living creatures, of moving creatures, animals, right? Even in that world, we can see evidence of intelligence. So the thing about it is that values are real, and they seem to, because the fact that they're not just human, they seem to have an objectivity of their own, but it is not an objectivity that puts them on a level or within the same space as the objects, the things that we encounter in the natural world. And so philosophers make that distinction between what they call facts on the one hand and values on the other. Now, they are facts and their values. Very famous 18th century philosopher David Hume was one of the first persons to make that distinction. And he said that there really is no logical relationship between a fact and a value. Values just exist. We intuit them, we sense them, we experience them. But in a sense, they have nothing to do with the world of facts. The world of facts do not in itself recommend values, suggest values, lead us to values, right? We have to employ values, right, to determine how we are going to manage states of affairs in the real world, how we are going to manage objects, and how we are going to manage relationships in the real world. But values themselves are really separate and distinct, and that is called very often Hume's fork. Fork meaning that branches off in two separate areas and has no relationship with, which have no relationship with each other, which go in opposite directions. Hume's fork, the radical distinction between fact and value, between is and ought. The fact, the world of fact is the world of is. The world of value is the world of ought. When I talk about moral principles, for example, I'm talking about values. And the realm of values very often is divided into two primary areas. You can talk about other kinds of values besides those two, but two dominant areas within axiology is the area of ethics on the one hand and the area of aesthetics on the other. Now, ethics has to do with right and wrong. It has to do with injustice and justice. It has to do with the moral life of human beings. And ethical principles, ethical imperatives provide us with guidelines for living. 10 Commandments, for example, is a good example of a compilation of ethical principles and imperatives, right, which are designed to guide human beings in living in this world among themselves, with their God, and with other fellow human beings, right? And Christianity has expanded on that. Well, those of you who are New Testament scholars would know what Paul did with the Old Testament imperative, what Christ did and Paul did with the Old Testament imperatives, spin them around, right, and make them not just negative prohibitions, but positive guidelines. The same thing, right? Emphasize the positivity of values and not the negativity of moral inhibitions. But they all belong to the realm of values. They all belong to the realm of ethics. These are the principles of ethics by which we live. But there's also aesthetics, the realm of beauty. Aesthetics very often seems to point to a realm of human experience that some philosophers have described as being beyond good and evil. The realm of aesthetics, whether something is just or unjust is irrelevant. Whether something is good or evil is irrelevant. Things are either beautiful or ugly. Notions of the sublime and of the transcendent define our aesthetic experience. And that's the kind of experience we enjoy when we're listening to a beautiful piece of music, whether it's a Trinidad Calypso, whether it's a Bach or aria or oratorio, or whether it's a symphony by Beethoven, beautiful. Or when we are looking at a beautiful painting of Michelangelo, a Leroy Clark, right? We have a certain kind of experience which can't be categorized as good or bad, but certainly an experience which seems to lift the human being, which seems to inspire, which seems to evoke a certain range of feeling or affect within us, right? That contributes to the quality of living, the quality of life that we wish to experience. And so aesthetics is a very important area, and there are some philosophers who are really just philosophers. If you're a philosopher of art, for example, you're dealing just with the realm of the aesthetics, and your discourse and your writings and your analyses will all be oriented to or focused on the area of feeling, of affect. So axiology is the third very important category of philosophical discourse. And it is something that we are going to be returning to continuously as we advance in this course. Right? We're going to be looking at a range of philosophers. The study of philosophy really is a study of the best ideas of the best minds. And when we examine these minds, we are going to find that these are the primary issues with which they are dealing, with which they contend. Right? A lot of philosophical writing can be very tough. It's not very easy. There's a lot of philosophy that has been written, and is written even today, in which philosophers themselves are baffled in the attempt to understand precisely what is said. My own experience, for example, at this particular time is that I'm reading a number of men who are difficult to understand. Sometimes you read the entire book and you're not sure you're able to grasp the meaning. You have to read it a second time. You have to read a critic on it to get an insight into how to approach and how to begin to understand what is said. Language is tough. The perceptions are very, very sophisticated, right? They're not simplistic. Philosophers try to look at every aspect of a particular situation. And very often, the thought seems to go in advance of the language. The language seems to lack the competence to capture the thought. But whatever they are talking about, these are the areas that they are concerned about. Ontology, metaphysics on the one hand, epistemology on the other, and axiology on the third. Now, there are a number of other disciplines that are very important for the study of philosophy. And I would want to look at some of them at this particular point in time. There are 4 of them that I have enumerated. Now, I said at the beginning that philosophy is concerned with all areas of knowledge. So that 4 should not limit you in your recognition of the vast relevance of philosophy to all areas of human thought and human activity. But I thought I should mention these 4 because they are also foundational. One is the area of cosmology. My philosophers are very much concerned with cosmology. Cosmology is the theory of the cosmos. What is the nature of the cosmos? What is this universe in which we live all about? How is it designed? Right? How does it function? Where is it heading to? These are cosmological issues. What does it consist of? And perhaps our experience of the universe, and when I talk about the universe, I'm talking at once about the realm of my own personal experience and the experience of other human beings in this world, but I'm also talking about the realm of the otherworldly, perhaps the realm of the transcendent, but more especially the realm, the region of the stars, the heavens, the vast outstretch of existence, physical, and which seems to be very physical to us, that exists beyond our reach. We look up in the sky and we see stars and we see the sun, and we see all of these things moving in a particular direction from east to west, both night and day. We get a sense that we are standing on a solid earth. Early cosmologies have taken that very simplistic experience of the universe as an authentic experience, as an authentic indication as to what the universe really is like. And so when we look at early cosmologies, the Ptolemaic system in ancient times, the time of the Romans and Greeks, they saw the world as flat, extended, stretched out, and stationary, because that's our experience. They saw the heavens as rotating around the earth. Earth was in the very center of things. The stars in the heavens, right? The fixed stars, as they were called, seem to be clinks in the fabric of the firmament, right? That solid blue, whatever is up there, through which light from heaven pours forth, right? So that was the general understanding of our cosmological world. That notion, that cosmology was radically altered, right, by in the Renaissance period by a new set of thinkers. It's referred to as the Copernican Revolution because Copernicus was the first to enunciate a new theory of the universe. Universe being heliocentric, a universe in which the sun was at the center and the earth was really moving around the sun. And that was a strange kind of experience. In fact, when Copernicus and eventually Galileo came up with that theory, the Catholic Inquisition decided to end the story right there and then, because as far as they were concerned, it not only contradicted notions of the world and the universe in the Bible, but it just did not make sense because it did not correspond to what our senses are experiencing. It's just downright foolishness, right? And but it eventually won over because it provided a much simpler explanation for the nature of reality. And we now are convinced that we really live in a world that is moving, it's rotating, it's not flat and extended, it's spherical, it's spinning around its axis, it's going around the sun. And we know that the sun is in the center of the system that we belong to. We call it the solar system. So that view became dominant. That new cosmology, that new worldview became dominant, right? And retained its dominance for quite some time. Now, what it did is that it clearly had implication for epistemology, because that new radically redefined universe, defined in the Copernican system, was a universe that did not correspond to our common sense, our everyday, our sensory experience of the external reality before us and around us. It did not correspond to that. Clearly, what was happening was that our eyes were deceiving us, right? Our senses were deceiving us. And that created new problems for philosophers, new problems for epistemologists. And that's one of the reasons why epistemology became so very central in contemporary and modern philosophical interest and discussion, simply because that Copernican universe radically overturned what we consider to be a very simplistic, ready-made, common sense view of reality. Today, now we have a vision of a far more complex universe than the Copernican universe. The sun is no longer at the center of it. The sun is at the center of our solar system, but our solar system is one among millions of solar systems within the galaxy. We belong to the Milky Way galaxy. With the discovery of the Hubble telescope a few decades ago, it was recognized that Not only do we have one galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, we have millions of galaxies stretching throughout the universe. Right? The universe seems to be a vast, complex place. And in fact, scientists are talking about a universe that is expanding. So contemporary worldviews have changed significantly. Contemporary cosmologies have changed significantly. And that is always going to have implications for philosophical inquiry. Right? The changing worldviews. Worldview is a central concern of philosophical discussion. And then there's a question of anthropology. Anthropology has to do with the study of human nature, the study of man. But what is the nature of human being? Very early philosophers turned their attention away from the external world to the human world, the world of human relationships, and the realm of human interiority. Because we have interior lives, we live interior lives, right? We are a secret to everyone else. We have a personal self that we hold dearly, that we very often develop defenses to protect ourselves from attacks of others, from the gaze of others, from the penetration of others, from the scrutiny of the other person. We try to maintain that private world. And that is a world of deep philosophical interest. That's where the realm of values are going to be found and so on. So a lot of philosophical discussion really is in the area of anthropology, the nature of the mind, the nature of man, the nature of human society, of human customs and values and institutions and political systems and economic systems and so on. Philosophers are rambling through all of these various areas of contemporary thought and science and trying to understand in the attempt to understand what essentially is the human. The third area is the area of theology. And well, it's little I can tell you about that. But the area of theology is significant because it deals with the transcendent, with that which is beyond the physical and beyond the human too. Human beings participate in transcendence, right? But we are physical, biological objects, entities in the real world. But the world of transcendence is the world of God, the world of demons and angels, the world of spirit. That's the realm of transcendence, and that's what religion deals with. When we look at the history of religion, we see that religion has passed through things like animism, where early pre-modern societies believed that the objects of the natural world were just like human beings. They had there were spiritual entities, they had a spiritual presence somewhere in them, and they were conscious, and they could respond and react to the forms of the animal world or the human world. And more developed societies moved towards polytheism, right? Polytheistic, they no longer saw the objects of the natural world as been animated by spiritual forces, but they saw the natural world as having certain departments that were governed by certain gods or goddesses. Agriculture would normally have a goddess, and the sky would be a male god, and the sea would be a male god, and so on. War would have a male god, and love would have a female goddess, and so on. All of these areas of human experience and life, all of these categories of the natural world were ruled by gods and goddesses. And then people recognized that didn't make too much sense. There's a fundamental unity about everything in the real world, and therefore there must be a single God that governs. Even in the polytheistic period, there was always a chief God. By the time we turn to monotheistic religions, we recognize, and those are the Abrahamic religions primarily, although there were evidences of monotheism in other parts of the world like Egypt and so on. Yet we find that the Abrahamic religions have stressed the singleness of God, God as essentially one. And that has become the dominant notion of God, right? Even people who may not be Christians or Jews or Muslims, many people believe that there is a God, there is a reason behind the universe, and it's a single entity. It's not a multiplicity of entities. And then there's pantheism, which extends beyond monotheism and sees God not only as overarching his universe, ruling and controlling his universe, but they see God as one with his universe and permeating that universe. But these are all very interesting theological concepts, and they are always subject to examination by philosophical inquiry. So philosophy is very much concerned with the area of theology. And finally, there is the whole question of psychology, the nature of the human mind. We talked about anthropology. Now, inherent in anthropological discussion, and anthropology concentrates much more on human collectivities, how people live in society, and so on. But psychology is concerned essentially with the human mind, the interior, the internal aspect of the human mind. What does that mind consist of? And psychology is something that was in a way became a science in the 19th century. And we have had, it's just branched off into so many areas. There is psychotherapies, there's psychoanalysis, there are various psychologies like ego psychology and so on. Many people in this university are studying psychology, studying behavioral psychology. So there are a number of branches of psychology. More and more people are reluctant to talk about the mind because psychology focuses on the mind or the psyche. But more and more, given the fact that there's an overarching materialistic approach to reality, a number of people prefer to talk about the brain, and therefore the neurosciences are now making very significant statements about man and his modalities of thought and the instruments that he uses. So a number of people feel that the neurosciences are giving us a better insight into the nature of how we think, how we feel, how we behave than the study of psychology does, because it's a scientific discipline, right? It looks inside the brain, it identifies the cortex and the various parts of the cortex and the subcortical structures of the brain, the limbic system and and things like that. And so we can better understand man if we understand how these various parts of the human mind function. The human brain is the center of a massive nervous system that extends to all parts of the body. So these are the primary areas, I would say, of philosophical concern. Finally, especially in recent times, people have begun to, a number of modern philosophers have begun to argue that philosophy really has nothing to tell anybody, right? The other sciences, yes, I was saying that finally, the other sciences are the ones that are capable of telling you, giving you an idea of content. All that philosophy is concerned with is determining method of inquiry. A number of contemporary schools, positivist philosophy, analytical philosophy, empirical philosophy, logical empiricism, language philosophy, claim that philosophy really is about method, about how we are able to access knowledge, handle knowledge, understand truth, analyze statements. That is what philosophy is all about. So philosophical methodology has also become central to a number of contemporary schools of philosophy. And a fair amount of what we do will have to essentially be in the category of philosophical methodology, right? What is the correct method of philosophy? Philosophy employs empirical methods